I was holding the heavy brass key to my mother's sewing room when I heard my sister, Carrie's, laughing in the kitchen with the estate lawyer. It wasn't the laughter of grief, or even the polite, strained chuckle of someone trying to ease a tense room. It was the sharp, jagged sound of a woman who had already spent the inheritance in her head. My mother hadn't been cold for 72 hours, and yet the house, the air itself, already felt like it was being auctioned off piece by piece. "I'm sure Miriam won't mind," Carrie said, her voice carrying up the stairs with that practiced, honeyed authority she used whenever she was about to take something that wasn't hers. "She's always been the sentimental one. She'll want the scrapbooks and the old linens. I'll take the property deed and the accounts. It's cleaner that way, don't you think, Mr. Vance?" I looked down at the key in my palm. It had left a deep, red dent in my skin. My mother, Lyra, had been a woman of precise silences and hidden compartments. For 30 years, I was the daughter who stayed. I was the one who changed the linens, who crushed the pills into her applesauce, and who felt the slow, agonizing thrum of her fatting pulse under my thumb. Carrie's was the daughter who sent postcards from coastal cities and called once a quarter to complain about her Pilates instructor. I pushed the key into the lock. It didn't turn easily. The wood had swollen from the humidity of a humid Georgia spring, or perhaps the room was simply resisting me. When the bolt finally clicked, the scent hit me first: lavender, stale peppermint, and the metallic tang of old sewing machine oil. The room was exactly as she had left it. A half-finished quilt, a chaotic burst of indigo and cream, lay draped over the workstation. But I wasn't here for the fabric. I walked to the floorboard beneath the window, the one tucked behind the heavy oak radiator that leaked every winter. I knelt, my joints complaining against the hard floor, and pulled at the loose edge of the wood. My breath hitched. My mother had told me, in the final, delirious hours of her life, that there was a second ledger. She had whispered it while Carrie's was out in the hallway, loudly arguing with a florist about the price of lilies. "Miriam," she had wheezed, her fingers clawing feebly at my wrist. "Don't let her sell the orchard. Look under the radiator, the blue book, not the black one, the blue one." I reached into the dark gap, and my fingers brushed cold leather. I pulled out a small, sapphire-colored notebook tied shut with a frayed silk ribbon. As I untied it, a folded slip of paper fell out. It was a receipt, dated 3 weeks ago, for a private loan. My heart dropped into my stomach as I read the name on the debtor line. It wasn't a stranger. It was Carrie's husband, Bram, and the amount was nearly the entire value of the family's liquid assets. I sat there on the floor, the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of afternoon light, realizing that the clean division Carrie's was currently pitching downstairs wasn't just greed. It was a cover-up. She wasn't just trying to take the lion's share. She was trying to hide the fact that she had already stolen it. The floorboards creaked in the hallway. The laughter had stopped. "Miriam," Carrie's called out, her footsteps approaching the door. "Are you in there? Mr. Vance needs you to sign the preliminary inventory. Honestly, you've been brooding in there for 20 minutes. We have a lot to get through." I didn't answer. I shoved the blue ledger into the waistband of my trousers and pulled my sweater down to cover it. My hands were shaking, so I shoved them into my pockets. The door pushed open. Carrie stood there, perfectly composed in a black silk blouse, her eyes scanning the room like a predator evaluating a carcass. She looked at the quilt, then at me, her gaze lingering just a second too long on the radiator behind me. "What are you doing on the floor, Vivi?" she asked, using the childhood nickname that felt like a slap. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just looking for a lost needle," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'd hate for someone to get pricked." Carrie's tilted her head, a small, tight smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Well, leave the cleaning for later. We have things to discuss. Important things." I walked past her, the weight of the hidden book pressing against my spine. As I reached the stairs, I realized the woman I had shared a womb with was a stranger, and the war for my mother's legacy had begun before she was even in the ground. I didn't just want the house anymore. I wanted to see the look on Carrie's face when she realized I knew exactly how much she owed. The dining room table felt miles wide. Mr. Vance sat at the head, his spectacles perched on the tip of a nose that seemed perpetually reddened by the cold. He was unboxing a stack of legal documents with a clinical efficiency that felt violent in the wake of my discovery. Carrie sat opposite me, her fingers drumming a restless, rhythmic beat against the mahogany surface. "Now," Mr. Vance began, clearing his throat. "The late Mrs. Galloway was quite specific about the physical property. The house and the surrounding 4 acres are to be held in a joint trust. However, the liquid assets, the savings accounts, the bonds, and the life insurance were left to be divided according to the standing debt of the heirs." I watched Carrie's. She didn't flinch. She picked up a crystal water glass, the condensation dampening her manicured fingertips. "And as we discussed, Mr. Vance, I've already provided the records for my own accounts. Bram and I are perfectly solvent. Miriam, on the other hand." She trailed off, casting a pitying look in my direction. "We all know how much the caregiving years cost. You haven't worked a traditional job in nearly a decade, Vivi. It's only fair that the cash goes towards setting you up, while I handle the liabilities of the estate." It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was painting herself as the selfless savior, framing my years of sacrifice as a financial burden she was graciously willing to overlook. She wanted the deed to the land that sat on the edge of a developing suburban corridor, and she was willing to give me a pittance of savings to get it. Savings that, according to the blue ledger currently burning a hole against my skin, didn't actually exist anymore. "What liabilities are those, Carrie's?" I asked quietly. She paused, the glass halfway to her lips. "The deferred maintenance on this mausoleum, for one. The back taxes Mother was so forgetful about. It's a headache, truly. I'm doing you a favor by taking the overhead off your plate." I looked at Mr. Vance. "Does the estate currently show a balance of $400,000 in the primary savings account? That was the figure Mom showed me last Christmas." Mr. Vance frowned, flipping through his ledger. "Actually, Ms. Galloway, the current balance is just under $12,000. There were significant withdrawals made via power of attorney over the last 6 months. I assumed you were aware, given you were the primary resident." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Carrie sighed, a sound of practiced exasperation. "We used that for the private nurses, Miriam, and the experimental treatments from that clinic in Switzerland. Don't tell me you forgot." "There were no private nurses," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I was the nurse. I bathed her. I changed her. And we never went to Switzerland. We never even left this county." Carrie's face didn't break, but her eyes hardened into flint. "Your memory has always been a bit selective under stress, dear. The point is, the money is gone, spent on Mother's comfort, which is why I'm proposing I take the deed and the debt, and you take the remaining $12,000 plus the contents of the house. It's the only way to keep you from drowning in taxes you can't afford." She was gaslighting me in front of an officer of the court. She knew that if I signed the inventory now, I was essentially agreeing that the money had been spent legitimately. I would be signing away my right to audit the accounts. I felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity. I looked at the blue book's edge peeking from my waistband, then back at my sister. She thought I was the same girl who used to let her steal my dolls because I didn't want to fight. She thought grief had made me soft. "I'm not signing anything today," I said, pushing the chair back. The screech of the wood against the floor sounded like a scream. "Miriam, don't be difficult," Carrie snapped, her composure finally fraying at the edges. "Mr. Vance is on a schedule. We need to settle this so the funeral arrangements can be finalized." "The funeral is paid for," I replied, standing tall. "Mom set aside a separate burial plot and a prepaid plan years ago. You'd know that if you'd answered her calls in October." I turned to Mr. Vance. "I'd like a week to review the withdrawal logs, personally." "That is within your rights," Vance said, looking uncomfortably between us. Carrie stood up, her chair clattering backward. "This is ridiculous. You're grieving and paranoid. Bram and I have been nothing but supportive." "I'm sure Bram has been very busy," I said, moving toward the kitchen. "I'll see you at the viewing tomorrow, Carrie's, where the pearls Mom gave you. The ones you told her you lost but are currently sitting in your handbag." I didn't wait for her response. I walked into the kitchen and locked the door behind me, leaning my head against the cool wood of the pantry. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I pulled the blue ledger out and opened it to the middle page. There, in my mother's cramped, arthritic handwriting, was a list of dates and figures. But it wasn't just a ledger of money. It was a diary of betrayal. April 14th, Carrie's called. Said Bram is in trouble with the investors again. She cried until I signed the blank withdrawal slip. She thinks I don't know he's gambling. She thinks I'm a fool. I'm not a fool. I'm a mother. And a mother protects the child who stays. Underneath the note was a small, hand-drawn map of the cellar. There was a circle drawn around the third stone from the coal chute. I looked out the kitchen window and saw Carrie's stomping toward her sleek silver SUV. She was on her phone, gesturing wildly, her face contorted in a silent rage. She wasn't leaving. She was regrouping. I had 24 hours before the viewing, and I realized then that the house wasn't just a home. It was a crime scene, and I was the only witness left. The silver SUV roared down the gravel driveway, leaving a plume of red Georgia dust that hung in the air like a localized storm. I watched from the window until the taillights vanished behind the weeping willows. The house fell into a silence so profound it felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were taking a long-delayed breath. I didn't head for the cellar immediately. I knew Carrie's. She was the type of person who would drive half a mile, pull over, and watch the house through the trees to see if I left or if I turned on specific lights. She played life like a game of poker where she assumed everyone else was playing with an open hand. I made a pot of tea. My hands were still trembling, so I focused on the ritual, the whistle of the kettle, the swirl of the amber liquid, the heat of the ceramic mug against my palms. I sat at the small breakfast nook where I had fed my mother every morning for 3 years. The linoleum was worn thin in the spot where her wheelchair used to rest. I opened the blue ledger again. My mother's words felt like a cold hand on my shoulder. A mother protects the child who stays. It was a heartbreaking admission. She had allowed Carrie's and Bram to bleed her dry, not out of weakness, but out of a calculated, sacrificial love, or perhaps a final, desperate attempt to buy Carrie's affection. But the second ledger suggested she had reached a breaking point. She had left me a roadmap to the truth because she knew Carrie's wouldn't just take the money, she would try to take my home. I finished the tea, turned off the kitchen light, and waited. I sat in the dark for nearly an hour, watching the moon rise over the orchard. Only then did I grab the heavy industrial flashlight from the utility closet and head for the basement door. The stairs to the cellar were steep and narrow, smelling of damp earth and the onions Mom used to store in burlap sacks. The air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, the flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating old trunks, crates of mason jars, and the hulking, rusted shape of the furnace. I found the coal chute. It was a relic of a time before the house was modernized, a small iron door set high in the foundation wall. Below it, the floor was composed of heavy, uneven fieldstones. I knelt, the dampness of the ground seeping through my jeans, and began counting. 1, 2, 3. The third stone looked no different from the others, gray, pitted, and seemingly immovable. I pried at the edge with a flathead screwdriver I'd tucked into my pocket. It didn't budge. I shifted my weight, digging the metal tip deeper into the mortar. With a gritty, grinding protest, the stone shifted. I hauled it upward, my muscles straining. Beneath it wasn't a stash of cash or jewelry. It was a vacuum-sealed plastic pouch. Inside was a thick envelope and a digital camera, one of those old, bulky point-and-shoots from a decade ago. I opened the envelope first. It contained a series of photographs. They weren't family portraits. They were pictures of Bram, Carrie's husband, meeting a man in a graying suit in the parking lot of a derelict motel on the outskirts of town. In several shots, Bram was handing over manila envelopes. In one particularly clear photo, the man in the suit was holding a document. It was the deed to this house. The date stamp was from 6 months ago. My stomach turned. Bram hadn't just been gambling with the cash. He had been using the house as collateral for a private loan. Carrie's hadn't been doing me a favor by offering to take the deed. She was trying to secure the property before the man in the suit came to collect on her husband's secret debt. Then I turned on the camera. The battery icon flickered red, nearly dead. I hit play on the only video file saved. The screen was grainy, the lighting poor. It was my mother's bedroom. She looked frail, propped up on pillows, but her eyes were sharp. The camera was clearly hidden on her nightstand, angled toward the door. The door opened. Carrie's walked in. She didn't look like the grieving sister she had played today. She looked frantic. "I need the signature, Mom." Carrie's voice came through the tiny speaker, tinny and sharp. "Bram is in over his head. They're going to take his practice. They're going to take everything." "I've given you enough, Carrie's." My mother's voice was a ghost of a whisper. "That money was for Miriam, for her life after I'm gone. She gave up everything for me." "Miriam is a martyr. She loves being a servant," Carrie's hissed, leaning over the bed. "She doesn't need a life. She'll just rot in this house anyway. Sign the transfer for the North Acreage. Now." The video cut out as the battery died, but the image of Carrie's face, twisted with a terrifying, entitled rage, remained burned into the darkness of the cellar. I sat there in the dirt, clutching the camera. I realized then that Carrie's didn't just want the inheritance. She hated me for the very thing she had forced me to become. I heard a soft thud from the floor above. A footstep. Not the heavy, confident stride of Carrie's, but the cautious, rhythmic step of someone trying to be silent. Someone was in the house, and they weren't using the front door. I killed the flashlight instantly. The darkness of the cellar swallowed me, thick and smelling of ancient dust. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest, thrumming against my ribs so hard I feared the intruder might hear it through the floorboards. Creak. It was the floorboard by the back mudroom, the one that always groaned when the temperature dropped or when a 180-pound man stepped on it. Bram. It had to be Bram. Carrie's was the architect, but Bram was the one who did the dirty work, the one whose desperation had turned him into a shadow of a man. I tucked the camera and the envelope back into the plastic pouch and shoved it deep into my waistband, securing it under the hem of my sweater. I stayed low, my knees grinding into the dirt, listening. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen. I heard the sound of a drawer being opened, the junk drawer where Mom kept the spare keys and the utility bills. Then, the heavy, metallic clatter of the silverware tray. He was looking for something, or perhaps he was looking for me. "Miriam." His voice was a low, jagged whisper that drifted down the cellar stairs. It sounded hollow, devoid of its usual arrogant shine. "Miriam, I know you're awake. I saw the tea kettle. We just want to talk. We're worried about you, Vivi." The use of the nickname in his mouth felt like a violation. I pressed my back against the cold stone of the foundation, my fingers curling around the heavy screwdriver I'd used to pry up the floor. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all I had. He moved toward the cellar door. I saw a sliver of light appear at the top of the stairs as he pushed it open. The yellow glow of a flashlight, stronger than mine, began to sweep across the upper steps. "Carrie said you were acting strange today," Bram said, his voice closer now. He was descending. Slow, deliberate. "She's upset. You know how she gets. We're family, Miriam. We should be looking out for each other, not hiding things." I realized I couldn't stay by the coal chute. If he reached the bottom, he'd pin me in the corner. I began to crawl, silent as a ghost, toward the back of the cellar where the old fruit preserves were stacked in towers of glass jars. The shadows there were deeper, protected by the bulk of the furnace. The beam of his light hit the floor, dancing over the spot where I had been sitting seconds ago. I heard him pause. He saw the disturbed dirt. He saw the stone I hadn't quite replaced. "Well, well," he muttered. The tone of his voice shifted. The faux concern vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. "So the old lady did tell you. I told Carrie she was getting chatty at the end." I reached the shelving unit. My hand brushed against a jar, pickled beets from 3 summers ago. The glass was cool and sticky. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. Bram reached the loose stone. I heard the scrape of his leather boots as he knelt. "Empty," he hissed. I could hear the sheer panic in that single word. To Bram, that missing pouch wasn't just evidence. It was his life. If that deed and those photos reached the wrong hands, his investors, The ones who didn't use lawyers would do more than just take his medical practice. He stood up abruptly, the beam of his light swinging wildly around the room. "Miriam, give it to me, right now. You don't understand what's happening here. This isn't about some petty inheritance. There are people. You don't want to know these people." He started kicking over crates, the sound of splintering wood echoing like gunshots in the confined space. He was losing it. The polished, professional son-in-law was stripping away, revealing the terrified, cornered animal underneath. "I know you're down here," he roared, his voice cracking. "I can smell your damn tea." He swung the light toward the preserve shelves. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying the shadows would hold. The light passed over me, snagging for a split second on the chrome buckle of my belt, but he was moving too fast, his eyes searching for a person, not a glint of metal. Then his phone rang. The sound was deafening in the silence. He snapped the light off, and I heard him fumble with his pocket. "What?" he barked into the phone. A pause. I could hear Carrie's voice on the other end, a frantic, high-pitched buzz. "No, she's not in the bedroom," Bram whispered harshly. "I'm in the basement. She's found it, Carrie's. The stone is up. It's gone. Everything is gone." Another pause. Carrie's was talking faster now, her voice cold enough to freeze the air. "Fine," Bram said. "Search the car. If it's not in the house, she must have put it in that rusted-out sedan of hers. Just get it. I'll deal with her." He hung up and turned his light back on, but he didn't look toward me. He turned and ran back up the stairs, his footsteps heavy and panicked. The cellar door slammed shut, and I heard the unmistakable sound of the deadbolt clicking into place. He hadn't found me, but he had trapped me. I sat in the dark, the silence returning like a shroud. Upstairs, I heard the muffled sound of my front door opening and closing. They were outside now, tearing apart my car, looking for a ghost. I looked up at the coal chute, the small, iron square set high in the wall. It was the only way out, and it was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I looked at the blue ledger in my hand. A mother protects the child who stays. "I'm still here, Mom," I whispered into the dark, "and I'm not leaving without the truth." Iron door of the coal chute was rusted shut, its hinges fused by decades of neglect and Georgia humidity. I stood on a stack of old milk crates, my fingers clawing at the latch. Above me, I could hear the muffled, rhythmic thud of my car door being slammed, followed by Carrie's muffled shout of frustration. They were losing time, and that made them dangerous. I leaned my weight into the screwdriver, wedging it into the seam of the iron flap. My muscles screamed, and the smell of oxidized metal filled my nose. With a sudden, jarring crack that echoed through the basement like a bone breaking, the seal gave way. A spray of dead leaves and cold night air hit my face. I hauled myself up, my elbows scraping against the rough concrete of the foundation. I was never the athletic daughter. Carrie's was the one who took ballet and tennis while I stayed inside, learning how to mend hems and temper chocolate. But desperation provides a different kind of strength. I wiggled through the narrow opening, the sapphire ledger pressing painfully into my ribs until I tumbled out onto the damp mulch of the flower bed. I lay there for a second, my cheek pressed against the cold earth, smelling the faint, sweet scent of the primroses I had planted last spring. "Check the shed." Bram's voice came from the driveway, sharp and jagged. I stayed low, crawling behind the thick hedge of boxwoods that lined the side of the house. From my vantage point, I saw the silhouettes of my sister and her husband bathed in the harsh glow of my car's interior light. Carrie's was throwing the contents of my glove box onto the gravel, my napkins, my spare fuses, the emergency roadside kit. She looked feral. "She doesn't have it in the car, Bram," Carrie's hissed, her silhouette rigid. "She's smarter than that. She's probably halfway to the police station by now." "The cellar door is locked," Bram countered, packing a tight circle. "Unless she's a ghost, she's still in there, or she threw it in the well." "She's not in the well, she's watching us." Carrie's turned, her eyes scanning the dark perimeter of the yard. I froze, my breath hitching. For a heartbeat, I thought our eyes met through the leaves. "She's always watching, that's what she does. She sits in the corner and records everyone's sins while she plays the saint." The bitterness in her voice was staggering. It wasn't just about the money or the house. She hated the fact that I had been the one to witness our mother's slow decline. She hated that I held the memories she had been too cowardly to collect. I needed to get to my car, but they were blocking the driveway. My only other option was the old tractor path that led through the orchard to the main road, but that was a mile-long trek in the dark, and they had a vehicle. Then I remembered the spare key. My mother had kept a spare set of keys for Bram's SUV in the mudroom, a relic from a time when she still trusted them to drive her to her doctor's appointments. If I could get back into the mudroom through the window. I began to move, staying in the deep shadows of the house. I reached the mudroom window, a small, casement-style opening that I'd left unlatched to let the paint fumes out a week ago. I pushed it up an inch at a time, the wood groaning softly. Inside, the house felt different. It felt like a trap. I stepped onto the linoleum, my wet shoes making a faint squelch. I moved toward the key hook behind the door. My fingers found the heavy fob for the silver SUV. Just as I gripped it, the kitchen light flickered on. I ducked behind the laundry machine, my heart hammering against the blue ledger. "I'm telling you, she isn't in the basement," Carrie said, her voice now dangerously close, just on the other side of the kitchen door. I heard the jingle of her own keys. "I'm going to call the sheriff. I'll tell them she's had a breakdown, that she's threatening us. If we get her committed for a 48-hour observation, we can find that book and clear the house before she's even released." "Carrie's that's filing a false report," Bram whispered, though he didn't sound like he was objecting. He sounded like he was calculating the odds. "It's not false if she's actually acting crazy, is it?" Carrie's replied. The coldness in her tone was absolute. "And hiding in the dark, stealing documents, and refusing to sign legal papers. Sounds like a mental health crisis to me. Grief does strange things to sentimental people." I looked at the key in my hand. I had the evidence of their fraud, their theft, and their husband's secret debts. But Carrie's was right about one thing. In this town, she was the successful daughter with the doctor husband and the expensive clothes. I was the unemployed sister who lived with her mother. If she called the sheriff now, I wouldn't be the witness. I'd be the suspect. I didn't wait. I slipped out the mudroom door, staying low as I rounded the back of their silver SUV. The driver's side door was unlocked. I slid into the leather seat, the smell of Carrie's expensive perfume, something floral and aggressive, filling my lungs. I pushed the ignition. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the dark like twin sabers, catching Carrie's and Bram's standing in the middle of the driveway. Carrie's face went white. She didn't move. She just stared at me through the windshield, her phone pressed to her ear. I didn't look back. I slammed the car into reverse and floored it, the tires spitting gravel as I tore away from the only home I had ever known, headed for the one person in town who hated Carrie's Galloway more than I did. The silver SUV handled the winding backroads of the county with a precision my old sedan could never muster. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights chasing me through the pines, but the road remained a ribbon of empty black. Carrie's and Bram were stranded at the house with my car, a car that required a specific trick with the ignition and had less than a gallon of gas in the tank. I had bought myself 20 minutes, maybe 30. I pulled into a gravel lot screened by overgrown wisteria and rusted farm equipment. This was the back entrance to Elias Thorne's workshop. Elias had been my mother's lawyer for 20 years before he was retired, by a scandal Carrie's had quietly orchestrated 4 summers ago. She had whispered in the right ears at the country club about Elias' failing memory and a supposed drinking problem, all because he had blocked her first attempt to sell off the orchard while Mom was still lucid. Now, he spent his days restoring antique clocks and nursing a profound, quiet resentment toward the Galloway name. I pounded on the heavy oak door. A dog barked, a deep, barrel-chested sound, and a moment later, a yellow porch light flickered on, casting long, sickly shadows across the porch. "Miriam," Elias stood there, wearing a grease-stained apron over a flannel shirt. He looked older than I remembered, his hair a wild halo of white. "It's nearly midnight. I heard about Lyra. I'm sorry I didn't come to the house. I figured your sister wouldn't appreciate the company." "She wouldn't," I said, my voice cracking for the first time that night. Elias, I need you to look at something, please. She's trying to have me committed. He ushered me inside. The workshop smelled of lemon oil and old brass. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, their rhythmic ticking creating a heartbeat for the room. I pulled the blue ledger and the digital camera from my waistband and laid them on a workbench between a dismantled grandfather clock and a set of precision screwdrivers. Elias didn't say a word. He put on his spectacles and began to read. I watched his face, the way his jaw tightened as he scanned the dates and the figures, the way his eyes narrowed at the mention of Bram's investors. The Swiss clinic, he muttered, shaking his head. I remember Carrie's mentioning that at the funeral home. I knew it smelled like a lie. Lyra hated flying. It's not just the money, Elias, I said, handing him the digital camera. The battery is dead, but there's a video. Carrie's was badgering Mom to sign the deed while she was on her deathbed. And Bram, he's already leveraged the house. There are photos in that envelope. Elias opened the manila envelope and spread the photos out under a jeweler's lamp. He whistled low. That man in the suit, that's Sela's vein. He's not an investor, Miriam. He's a predatory lender. He specializes in buying properties from people who can't go to a traditional bank because their records are, let's say, creative. Carrie's is calling the sheriff, I said, leaning against the workbench. The ticking of the clocks was starting to feel like a countdown. She's going to tell them I've lost my mind. If they take me in, she'll find this. She'll burn it. Elias looked at me, his eyes sharp and clear. The failing memory Carrie's had gossiped about was nowhere to be seen. She can't have you committed without a second signature or a clear history of instability, but she can make things very difficult for you in a town where her husband is the lead surgeon at the regional hospital. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a clean thumb drive. First, we back this up. Everything. The photos, the video, the ledger pages. Then we don't go to the sheriff. Why not? Because the sheriff plays poker with Bram every Tuesday night, Elias said grimly. We go to the district attorney's office in the morning, but you can't be at home tonight, and you can't be here. Carrie's knows I'm the first person you'd run to. Where do I go? The funeral home, Elias said, a grim smile touching his lips. The viewing is at 10 tomorrow morning. The director, Mr. Henderson, owed your mother a great deal of respect. He's a man who understands the sanctity of a closed door. Carrie's would never think to look for you there, sitting with the body. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but the logic was cold and perfect. To Carrie's, my mother was already an asset to be liquidated. She wouldn't expect me to be anywhere near the casket until I had to play the part of the grieving sister for the cameras. One more thing, Elias said, sliding the thumb drive into his computer. Lyra called me a week before she passed. She couldn't talk long, but she asked me if I still had the original annex. I didn't know what she meant then. I thought she was rambling. He looked at the blue ledger. But looking at this, I think I know. There's a third party involved, Miriam. Someone who isn't Carrie's or Bram. Someone who has been helping them move the money. Suddenly, the headlights of a car swept across the workshop windows, the light raking over the ticking clocks. The dog began to growl, a low vibration in its throat. Go, Elias whispered, shoving the ledger and a copy of the thumb drive into my hands. Through the back woods, there's a path to the funeral home's service entrance. I'll keep them busy. I didn't have time to thank him. I slipped out the back door just as the sound of tires crunching on gravel erupted in the front. I ran into the dark, the rhythm of 100 clocks still echoing in my ears, knowing that the most dangerous place to hide was exactly where I was headed, right next to the dead. The backwoods were a tangle of briars and ancient, rotting pine needles that muffled my footsteps. I moved by instinct, the sapphire ledger clutched to my chest like a shield. Behind me, I heard the muffled shout of a man, Bram, and the sharp, commanding tone of Carrie's as they confronted Elias. The sound faded into the wind, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant, lonely whistle of a freight train. The Henderson funeral home appeared like a Victorian ghost at the edge of the woods. It was a sprawling, white-columned manor that smelled perpetually of lilies and floor wax. I reached the service entrance, a heavy steel door used for deliveries. I pressed the buzzer, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The door creaked open to reveal Mr. Henderson. He was a thin man with skin the color of parchment and eyes that had seen every shade of human sorrow. He looked at my muddy shoes, my tear-streaked face, and the expensive silver SUV key I was still clutching. He didn't ask questions. "She's in Chapel A, Miriam," he said softly, stepping aside. "I've finished the preparations. I'll lock the gates. No one comes in until the morning staff arrives at 8. "Thank you, Arthur," I whispered. The interior of the funeral home was silent, the air chilled to a precise, preservationist temperature. I walked down the carpeted hallway, my reflection ghosting across the polished mahogany wainscoting. When I entered Chapel A, the scent of roses was overwhelming. There she was, my mother. In the dim, amber glow of the morning lamps, she looked younger. The lines of pain that had etched her face for years had been smoothed away by the mortician's art. She looked peaceful, but to me, she looked like a secret kept too long. I pulled a velvet chair close to the casket and sat. I opened the blue ledger to the final page, the one Elias had pointed to. Underneath the drawing of the cellar, there was a single name and a phone number written in a shaky, desperate hand: Lydia Vance. My heart stopped. Vance. The same name as the estate lawyer, the man who had sat at our table today and watched Carrie's lie through her teeth. Lydia was his wife. She had been my mother's bridge partner for years, the only person besides me who visited the house regularly during the final months. I had always thought of her as a fluttery, harmless woman who brought lemon bars and gossip. But if my mother had noted her name here, in the ledger of betrayals, then the clean division of the estate wasn't just Carrie's plan. It was a coordinated strike involving the very person supposed to protect the will. I looked at the thumb drive Elias had given me. It contained the evidence of Bram's debt and Carrie's manipulation, but it didn't explain how they had moved $400,000 out of a monitored account without raising a red flag. I leaned closer to my mother, my forehead resting against the cool wood of the casket. "What did they do, Mom?" I whispered. "How deep does this go?" As if in answer, I noticed a small irregularity in the lace collar of my mother's burial dress. It was a dress I had chosen, a high-necked silk gown she had worn to my graduation. But the brooch, the antique cameo that was supposed to be pinned to her chest, was missing. In its place was a small, white slip of paper, tucked partially into the fabric of the lining, where only someone adjusting the body would find it. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the silk. I pulled the paper free. It wasn't a note. It was a carbon copy of a wire transfer receipt. Amount: $412,000. Recipient: the Vance Charitable Trust. Authorized by Carrie's Galloway POA. The date was the day after my mother had lost the ability to speak. Carrie's hadn't just spent the money on Bram's debts. She had laundered it through the lawyer's own charity, likely in exchange for him falsifying the estate's liabilities and helping her seize the deed. It was a perfect circle of corruption. The lawyer got a cut, the husband got his debt cleared, and Carrie's got the land. And I was supposed to get $12,000 and a house I couldn't afford to keep. Suddenly, the silence of the funeral home was shattered by the muffled sound of a car door closing in the parking lot. Then another. I stood up, shoving the receipt and the ledger into my pocket. I looked at the security monitor on the wall near the chapel entrance. 2 figures were standing at the front gate, silhouetted by the streetlights. Carrie's and Mr. Vance. They weren't looking for me anymore. They were looking for the receipt. They had realized that in their haste to dress my mother, they had left the one piece of paper that could dismantle their lives right on her chest. "Arthur," I called out, but the hallway remained silent. I looked back at my mother. I wasn't just the sentimental daughter anymore. I was the one who had stayed, and now I was the one who was going to finish it. I didn't hide. I walked to the heavy chapel doors, gripped the brass handles, and waited for them to knock. The knock came, not a frantic pounding, but a rhythmic, authoritative rapping that echoed through the hollow spaces of the funeral home. Through the frosted glass of the chapel doors, I saw their shapes: Carrie's, tall and rigid, and the shorter, wider frame of Mr. Vance. They looked like shadows in a puppet theater. "Miriam, I know you're in there." Carrie's voice was muffled but sharp, cutting through the heavy scent of lilies. "Arthur let us in. He told us you were distressed. We're just here to help you, Vivi. Open the door. Let's talk like sisters." I looked at the security monitor. Arthur Henderson was nowhere to be seen. He hadn't let them in. They had likely pressured him with the weight of the Vance name or a threat to his business license. In this town, the law wasn't a set of rules. It was a social hierarchy, and I was at the bottom. I pulled the heavy brass bolt, the metal sliding home with a definitive thunk. I wasn't opening that door. Not yet. "I found it, Carrie's," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the wood. "The Vance Charitable Trust receipt. The $412,000. I know about the laundering. I know about Bram's debt to Sela's vein." The silence on the other side of the door was absolute. It lasted for 10, 15 seconds, a lifetime in a hallway filled with the dead. "Miriam," Mr. Vance's voice was different now. The professional, stuttering warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, dry rasp. "You are interfering in complex financial arrangements you don't understand. That money was moved to protect the estate from creditors. I was acting in your best interest as much as your sister. By charging a massive administration fee to your own charity," I countered. "By helping my sister steal the deed to a house I've spent my entire adult life maintaining. You're not a lawyer, Mr. Vance. You're a vulture." "Open the door, Miriam," Carrie screamed, her composure finally shattering. I heard her shoulder hit the wood. "You think you're so righteous. You stayed here because you were too scared to have a life of your own. You used Mom as an excuse to hide from the world, and now you want to be the hero. Give me that paper." "I've already sent the digital copies to Elias Thorne," I lied, my heart racing. "He's at the district attorney's office right now." I heard a muffled argument between the two of them. Carrie's wanted to break the door down. Vance was likely reminding her that a forced entry into a funeral home would be impossible to explain to the sheriff, even one who played poker with her husband. "She's bluffing," Carrie's hissed. "Elias is a drunk. No one listens to him. She has the physical receipt, Vance. If we get that, it's her word against ours. Who are they going to believe? The woman who hasn't held a job in 10 years and just lost her mother, or us?" I retreated from the door, moving back toward the casket. I looked at the sapphire ledger. My mother had been so careful, so precise. She had known Carrie's would come for the house. She had known the lawyer was corrupt. I realized then why she had chosen the graduation dress for her burial. I reached into the inner pocket of the dress, near the hem where the heavy silk folded over. My fingers brushed something hard and rectangular. I pulled it out. It was a small, digital voice recorder. The record light was dead, but the save light was a faint, flickering green. I pressed play, keeping the volume low. "Just sign it, Lyra. It's for the best. Miriam doesn't need to know about the trust. She'll be taken care of." That was Vance's voice. "And Bram," my mother's voice, sounding stronger than I had heard it in months. "Does this clear his debt to the veins?" "Every penny," Carrie's voice. "And we get the North Orchard. We can develop it by spring. Miriam can keep the house, Mom. We aren't monsters. We just need the land." "You're stealing from your sister," Mom whispered. "I'm taking what I earned by being the one who actually succeeded," Carrie snapped. "Now sign, or I'll make sure the state takes this house for the back taxes you forgot to pay. Miriam will be on the street by the end of the month." The recording ended with the sound of a pen scratching against paper. I felt a cold, calm fury wash over me. It wasn't just greed. It was a calculated plan to leave me with a house I couldn't afford to keep, forcing me to sell it to them for a fraction of its value later. They wanted everything: the money, the land, and my dignity. Outside, the scratching at the door stopped. "Miriam," Carrie's voice was eerily calm now. "We're leaving, but you should know. The sheriff is on his way. I called him from the car. I told him you were in a manic state and that you desecrated the body looking for hidden money. When he sees you in there, clutching receipts and screaming about conspiracies, well, I hope the hospital has a nice view." I heard their footsteps retreating, They weren't giving up. They were changing the battlefield. I looked at the recorder, the ledger, and the receipt. I had the truth, but they had the clock. And the clock was ticking toward 10 a.m., the start of the viewing when the whole town would be watching. I leaned over and kissed my mother's forehead. Her skin was as cold as marble. "I'm not hiding anymore, Mom," I whispered. I didn't wait for the sheriff. I picked up the heavy iron fire poker from the chapel hearth and walked to the stained glass window that led to the side garden. I didn't need a door. I needed an audience. The stained glass shattered with a melodic, terrifying crystalline ring. I stepped out into the cool, pre-dawn air of the garden, the sapphire ledger tucked firmly into my waistband. I didn't run for the woods this time. Instead, I walked around to the front of the funeral home and sat on the white marble steps, right under the grand portico. I didn't have to wait long. The first patrol car pulled into the circular drive at 6:15 a.m., its blue and red lights painting the white columns in rhythmic pulses of emergency. Sheriff Miller stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't have his gun drawn, but his hand was resting on his belt, a gesture of cautious authority. Behind him, Carrie's silver SUV lurched to a halt, and she practically tumbled out, her face a mask of performative terror. "There she is," Carrie's cried, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Sheriff, look at her. She's destroyed the chapel window. She's completely detached. Miriam, honey, please just come with the officers. We'll get you help." Sheriff Miller looked at me, then at the shattered glass behind me. "Miriam, Carrie says you've been acting erratic, says you've been making threats and interfering with your mother's remains. You want to tell me what's going on?" I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible. I felt a strange, detached stillness. For years, I had shrunk in the face of Carrie's noise. Now, the silence was my power. "I haven't touched my mother, Sheriff," I said, my voice steady and low. "I broke that window because I was locked in. My sister and Mr. Vance were trying to take a piece of evidence from me. A piece of evidence my mother left to ensure the truth came out." "She's delusional," Bram said, stepping up beside Carrie's. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. "She's been under a lot of pressure. The caregiving, it breaks people. She's inventing things to cope with the grief." "Is that right, Bram?" I asked, looking him directly in the eye. "And is the $400,000 missing from the estate also an invention? Is the debt you owe to Sela's vein just a coping mechanism?" Bram flinched at the mention of the name. Sheriff Miller's eyebrows shot up. Even in a town this small, everyone knew Sela's vein was the kind of name you didn't want associated with a respectable doctor. "I have the records," I said, holding up the blue ledger. "I have the wire transfer receipt to the Vance Charitable Trust. And," I paused, pulling the small digital recorder from my pocket, "I have my mother's voice, recorded the day she died, recording Carrie's and Mr. Vance threatening to put me on the street if she didn't sign over the orchard to pay for Bram's gambling." Carrie's lunged forward, her hand clawing for the recorder, but the sheriff stepped between us, his arm a solid bar of gold-braided wool. "Now, hold on a minute, Carrie's," Miller said, his tone shifting. He looked at the recorder in my hand, then back at Bram's sweating face. The poker buddy loyalty was visible, but it was being weighed against the very real possibility of a massive financial scandal involving the town's most prominent lawyer. "I want to hear it," Miller said. "This is an illegal recording," Carrie's shrieked. "She's a liar. She's been stealing from Mom for years. I have the power of attorney." Which is exactly why the district attorney will be interested in how that power was used. A new voice joined us. Elias Thorne stepped out from behind a parked hearse, looking remarkably sharp for a man who had been up all night. He held a leather briefcase and a look of grim satisfaction. "Sheriff, I've already filed a preliminary injunction with the county judge. We're freezing the estate assets and requesting an immediate audit of the Vance Charitable Trust." Carrie's turned on Elias, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. You senile old drunk, you have no standing." "I have the standing of a man who was Lyra Galloway's attorney for 20 years, Elias said smoothly. "And as of 4 a.m., I am the official representative of Miriam Galloway. were filing charges of elder abuse, grand larceny, and fraud. The sun began to crest over the trees, catching the dew on the grass and turning the world into a shimmering, cold gold. The town was starting to wake up. In a few hours, the pews of the chapel would be filled with neighbors, friends, and the very people Carries had spent her life trying to impress. Sheriff Miller sighed, looking at the ledger in my hand. "Miriam, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. And Bram, Carries, I think you two better follow us. We need to clear some things up before the funeral starts." "The funeral is at 10, I said, looking at Carries. She looked small now, huddled in her expensive clothes, the mask of the successful sister cracked beyond repair. "And it's going to proceed exactly as Mom wanted. But you won't be sitting in the front row, Carries. You won't be sitting there at all." As the sheriff led them toward the patrol cars, Carries looked back at me. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a cold, burning hatred. But for the first time in my life, that look didn't make me want to hide. It made me feel nothing at all. I walked back into the funeral home, past the shattered glass, and into the quiet of the chapel. I sat down next to my mother one last time. "The orchard is safe, Mom," I whispered. But as I sat there, the weight of the night began to settle in. I had won the battle, but I was still alone in a house filled with ghosts, and the man in the suit, Silas Vane, was still out there, holding a deed that he wouldn't give up without a fight. The story wasn't over. It was just getting quiet. The funeral was a quiet, muted affair. Without Carries and Bram there to orchestrate a grand display of performative mourning, the chapel felt lighter, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean. I sat in the front row alone, the space beside me empty, but for the scent of the blue ledger tucked into my purse. People whispered, of course. In a town this small, the sight of a doctor and his wife being escorted away by the sheriff at dawn was better than any Sunday sermon. As they lowered the casket into the red Georgia clay of the family plot, I didn't cry. I felt a strange, humming sense of equilibrium. I looked out over the north orchard, the trees heavy with the first blossoms of the season. They were mine now, not to sell, not to develop, but to keep. 3 days later, I was sitting on the back porch, a cold glass of tea sweating in my hand, when a black sedan pulled up the drive. It wasn't the sheriff, and it wasn't Elia's. A man stepped out. He was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my car, his gray hair slicked back with military precision. Silas Vane. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a banker who had never missed a meal. He walked up the porch steps, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the wood. "Miss Galloway," he said, stopping at the top step. He didn't offer his hand. "I believe you have something that belongs to me, or rather, I have something that belongs to you." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the deed to the house, the one Bram had signed away in a windowless motel room. "The sheriff tells me your brother-in-law won't be practicing medicine for a very long time," Vane said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "And Mr. Vance's charity is currently being dismantled by the state. It seems my collateral has become complicated." "It's not complicated, Mr. Vane," I said, not standing up. I stayed in my mother's old wicker chair. "It's illegal. The deed was signed under duress using a fraudulent power of attorney. Elias Thorne has already filed the paperwork to void the transfer. You can leave now." Vane looked at me for a long moment. He didn't scowl or threaten. He simply tilted his head, acknowledging a player who had finally learned the rules of the game. "Bram owed me a significant amount of money, Miriam. Money that was tied to some very unpleasant people. Without this house, those people are going to come looking for someone to blame." "Then I suggest you tell them to look in the county jail," I replied. "Because if you step foot on this property again, the next person you talk to won't be a grieving daughter. It will be the district attorney, and I'll hand him the original photos of your meeting at the motel. I kept the negatives, Silas. My mother was very thorough." It was a bluff. There were no negatives in a digital age, but the look in my eyes must have been convincing enough. Vane stared at me, then slowly, deliberately, he tore the deed in half. He dropped the pieces onto the porch floor. "Lyra always said you were the one to watch," he muttered. "She said you were the only one with her spine." He turned and walked back to his car. I watched him drive away, the dust settling back onto the gravel. I picked up the torn pieces of paper. They felt like nothing, just paper. That evening, I walked out into the orchard. The sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the rows of trees. I thought about Carrie's, sitting in a cold room, waiting for a lawyer who would never come. I thought about the years I had spent feeling invisible, the sentimental sister who was only good for changing bandages and keeping quiet. I realized then that my mother hadn't just left me a house and a ledger. She had left me a mirror. She had forced me to see the strength I had built in those quiet, grueling years of service. I wasn't the daughter who stayed because she was afraid. I was the daughter who stayed because I was the only one strong enough to carry the weight. I leaned against an old pear tree, the bark rough and real against my palm. The dripping faucet in the kitchen was fixed. The laundry was folded. The silence was no longer a burden, it was a sanctuary. I was Miriam Galloway. I was alone, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The battle for the house was over. The harvest was just beginning.